Hello and welcome. I'm glad that you can join me. We're here to learn how to write a compare and contrast paper. Now, with compare and contrast papers, you're going to be doing two things. You're going to be discussing how two things, theories, or topics are alike and how they're dissimilar. We've got two different approaches you can use, so let's look at them and see what works best for you. Let's get started. Writing compare and contrast papers can be challenging for students. There's a lot to cover. You have to describe the two things, and you also have to clearly present what the differences are and the similarities. It can become overwhelming unless you have a structure to help you organize it all, and one such structure can be based on differences and similarities. That is, you first talk about all the differences, and then you talk about all the similarities. Or you could talk about the similarities first before you move on to the differences. I have it here with differences first, but you can do it the other way. In the introduction, you'll introduce differences and similarities between the two things, and then you'll have a paragraph for each difference. So each difference will have its own attribute. What is the attribute you're comparing these two things on? For example, with apples and oranges, you can compare the colors of the fruit. When you state that you're examining them, one way they differ is color, then you'll say apples are red and oranges are orange. But you'll also conclude with an analysis or evaluation for this difference. So you might say that oranges are brighter and easier to see because they're orange rather than apples. For difference number 2, you'll talk about another attribute and it will follow each structure. So for each difference between the two things, each attribute will have its own paragraph. When you finish discussing all the differences, attribute by attribute, then you'll transition and you'll say something along the lines of how, while A and B have all these differences, they also are similar on a number of dimensions. And here, each similarity will have its own paragraph. So when you present each paragraph, each attribute will have its own paragraph, and you'll talk about the attribute that's similar between the two. What is A like on that attribute? And you'll provide evidence. What's B like on that attribute? You'll provide evidence. And then you'll provide some evaluation or analysis for this similarity. So for example, you might talk about the sweetness of the fruits. And both apples and oranges are sweet. You'll provide evidence for apples and oranges both being sweet, and then you'll provide some evaluation. Finally, in your conclusion, you'll summarize the similarities, the differences, and what it means. And that's the first approach for compare and contrast papers. Another way that you could organize compare and contrast papers is that you could organize them based on attributes. So for example, in your introduction, you'll provide an overview of the similarities and differences, and then you'll discuss each attribute. So for example, if we talk about two different kinds of birds, robins and parrots, you would talk about them being birds, and you would talk about how robins and parrots are similar in terms of being birds, and then you would talk about differences within the bird family, that parrots are larger than robins are. Then you would discuss the second attribute, and first you would discuss the similarities of the two types of birds or the two things on that attribute, and then discuss their differences, each time providing evidence. And you'll keep on going through each attribute or each trait that you're comparing for A and B, and then you'll end with a conclusion. So instead of organizing by all the similarities and all the differences, what you're doing is you're going attribute by attribute, and for each attribute, you're clearly describing how both are similar and both are different. So you have your choice for writing a compare and contrast paper. Happy writing.